Chapter 55. It is not so difficult to live the life that leads to heaven as is believed. There are some who believe that to live the life that leads to heaven, which is called the spiritual life, is difficult, because they have heard that man must renounce the world, must divest himself of the lusts called the lusts of the body and the flesh, and must live spiritually. And they take this to mean that they must discard worldly things, which consist chiefly in riches and honours, that they must walk continually in pious meditation about God, salvation and eternal life, and must spend their life in prayers and in reading the Word and pious books. They suppose these things to be renouncing the world and living in the Spirit and not in the flesh. But that the fact is entirely different has been given me to know by much experience and from conversations with the angels. I have learned, indeed, that those who renounce the world and live in the Spirit in this manner acquire a sorrowful life that is not receptive of heavenly joy, since everyone's life continues the same after death. On the contrary, to receive the life of heaven, a man must needs live in the world and engage in the duties and employments there, and by means of a moral and civil life, receive the spiritual life. In no other way can the spiritual life be formed with man, or his spirit prepared for heaven. For to live an internal life, and not at the same time an external life, is like dwelling in a house that has no foundation, that gradually sinks, or becomes cracked and rent asunder, or totters till it falls. If the life of man is scanned and explored by rational insight, it is found to be threefold, namely spiritual, moral, and civil, with these three lives distinct from each other. For there are men who live a civil life and not as yet a moral and spiritual life. And there are men who live a moral life and not as yet a spiritual life. And there are those who live a civil life, a moral life, and a spiritual life at the same time. These live the life of heaven, but the former live the life of the world separated from the life of heaven. From these things, in the first place, it can be established that the spiritual life is not a life separated from natural life or the life of the world, but is joined with it as the soul is joined with its body. And if it were separated, it would be, as just said, like living in a house that has no foundation. For moral and civil life is the activity of the spiritual life, since willing well belongs to spiritual life, and acting well to moral and civil life. And if the latter is separated from the former, the spiritual life consists solely of thought and speech, and the will, left with no support, recedes, and yet the will is the man's spiritual itself. That it is not so difficult as some believe to live the life that leads to heaven can be seen from the things that now follow. Who cannot live a civil and moral life? For everyone from his childhood is initiated into that life and learns what it is by living in the world. Moreover, everyone, whether evil or good, lives that life. For who does not wish to be called honest, and who does not wish to be called just? Almost everyone practices honesty and justice in externals, so far as to seem to be honest and just at heart, or to seem to act from real honesty and justice. The spiritual man ought to live in like manner, and can do so as easily as the natural man can, with this difference only, that the spiritual man believes in the divine and acts honestly and justly, not solely because so to act is in accord with civil and moral laws, but also because it is in accord with divine laws. As the spiritual man, in whatever he is doing, thinks about divine things, he has communication with the angels of heaven. And so far as this takes place, he is conjoined with them. And thereby is opened his internal man, which regarded in itself is the spiritual man. When man comes into this state, he is adopted and led by the Lord, although himself unconscious of it. And then whatever he does that is honest and just, pertaining to moral and civil life, is done from a spiritual motive. And doing what is honest and just from a spiritual motive is doing it from honesty and justice itself, or doing it from the heart. His justice and honesty appear in external form precisely the same as the justice and honesty with natural men and even with evil and infernal men. But in internal form they are wholly unlike. For evil men act justly and honestly solely for the sake of themselves and the world. And therefore, if they had no fear of laws and penalties, or the loss of reputation, of honour, of gain and of life, they would act in every respect insincerely and unjustly, since they fear neither God nor any divine law, and therefore are not restrained by any internal bond. Consequently, they would use every opportunity to defraud, plunder and spoil others, and this from delight. That inwardly they are such can be clearly seen from those of the same character in the other life, where everyone's externals are taken away, and his internals, in which he at last lives to eternity, are opened. As such, then act without external restraints, which are, as said above, fear of the law, of the loss of reputation, of honour, of gain and of life. They act insanely and laugh at honesty and justice. But those who have acted honestly and justly from regard to divine laws, when their externals are taken away and they are left to their internals, act wisely, because they are conjoined to the angels of heaven, from whom wisdom is communicated to them. From these things it can now first be established that when the internal man, that is, the will and thought, are conjoined to the divine, the civil and moral life of the spiritual man may be wholly like the civil and moral life of the natural man. Furthermore, the laws of spiritual life, the laws of civil life, and the laws of moral life are set forth in the 10 Commandments of the Decalogue. In the first 3, the laws of spiritual life. In the 4 that follow, the laws of civil life. And in the last 3, the laws of moral life. In external form, the merely natural man lives in accordance with the same commandments, in the same way as the spiritual man does. For in like manner he worships the divine, goes to church, listens to preachings, and assumes a devout countenance, refrains from committing murder, adultery and theft, from bearing false witness, and from defrauding his companions of their goods. But all these he does merely for the sake of himself and the world, for the sake of appearances. while in internal form such a person is the direct opposite of what he appears in external form, since in heart he denies the divine, in worship acts the hypocrite, and when left to himself and his own thoughts, laughs at the holy things of the church, believing that they merely serve as a restraint for the simple multitude. Consequently, he who is wholly disjoined from heaven, and not being a spiritual man, he is neither a moral man nor a civil man. For although he refrains from committing murder, he hates everyone who opposes him, and from his hatred burns with revenge, and would therefore commit murder if he were not restrained by civil laws and the external bonds that are his fears. And as he longs to do so, it follows that he is continually committing murder. Although he does not commit adultery, yet as he believes it to be allowable, he is all the while an adulterer, since he commits adultery to the extent that he has the ability and as often as he has opportunity. Although he does not steal, yet as he covets the goods of others and does not regard fraud and wicked devices as opposed to what is lawful, in intent he is continually acting the thief. The same is true of the commandments relating to moral life, which forbid false witness and coveting the goods of others. Such is every man who denies the divine, and who has no conscience derived from religion. That he is such is clearly evident from those of like character in the other life, when their externals have been removed, and they are let into their internals. As they are then separated from heaven, they act in unity with hell, and in consequence are associated with those who are in hell. It is not so with those who in heart have acknowledged the divine, and in the actions of their lives have had respect to divine laws, and have lived as fully in accord with the first 3 commandments of the Decalogue as they have in accord with the others. When the externals of such are removed, and they are let into their internals, they are wiser than they were in the world. When they come into their internals, it is like coming from darkness into light, from ignorance into wisdom, and from a sorrowful life into a happy life, because they are in the divine, thus in heaven. These things have been said to make known what the one kind of man is and what the other is, although they have both lived the same external life. Anyone can know that thoughts are led or tend in accord with the intentions, that is, in the direction that the man intends. For thought is man's internal sight, and resembles the external sight in this, that to whatever point it is directed or aimed, thither it turns, and there it rests. Therefore, if the internal sight, or the thought, is turned towards the world and rests there, it follows that the thought becomes worldly. If it turns to self and self-honour, it becomes corporeal. But if it is turned heavenwards, it becomes heavenly. So too, if turned heavenwards, it is elevated. But if turned selfward, it is drawn down from heaven and immersed in what is corporeal. And if turned towards the world, it is also turned downwards from heaven, and is diffused upon the objects that are before the eyes. Man's love is what makes his intention and determines the sight of the internal man, or the thought, to its objects. Thus, the love of self fixes it upon self and its objects, the love of the world upon worldly objects, and the love of heaven upon heavenly objects. So when the love is known, the state of the interiors, which are of the mind, can be known. That is, the interiors of one who loves heaven are raised towards heaven and are opened above, while the interiors of one who loves the world or who loves himself are closed above and are opened outwardly. From this, the conclusion follows that if the higher regions of the mind are closed above, man can no longer see the objects pertaining to heaven and the church, but those objects are in thick darkness to him, and the things in thick darkness are either denied or not understood. This is why those who love themselves and the world above all things, since the higher regions of their minds are closed, in heart deny divine truths. And if from their memory they say anything about them, they nevertheless do not understand them. Moreover, they regard them in the same way as they regard worldly and corporeal things. Man's intention, by which his internal sight or thought is determined, is his will. For what a man wills, he intends, and what he intends, he thinks. Therefore, if his intention is heavenward, his thought is determined heavenward, and with it his whole mind, which is thus in heaven. And from heaven he beholds the things of the world beneath him, like one looking down from the roof of a house. So the man who has the interiors of his mind opened can see the evils and falsities that are with him, for these are below the spiritual mind. On the other hand, the man with whom the interiors have not been opened is unable to see his evils and falsities, because he is not above them, but in them. From these things it can be concluded whence man has wisdom and whence insanity. Also, what a man will be after death, when he is left to will and think, and to act and speak in accordance with his interiors. All these things also have been said that it may be known what the quality of a man is interiorly, however he may seem outwardly to resemble others. That it is not so difficult to live the life of heaven as some believe is now clear from this, that when anything presents itself to a man that he knows to be dishonest and unjust, but to which his mind is born, it is simply necessary for him to think that it ought not to be done, because it is opposed to the divine precepts. If a man accustoms himself so to think, and from so doing establishes a habit of so thinking, he is gradually conjoined to heaven. And so far as he is conjoined to heaven, the higher regions of his mind are opened. And so far as these are opened, he sees whatever is dishonest and unjust. And so far as he sees these evils, they can be dispersed. For no evil can be dispersed until it is seen. Into this state man is able to enter because of his freedom. For is not anyone able from his freedom so to think? And when he has made a beginning, the Lord performs all the good deeds with him, and causes him not only to see the evils to be evils, but also to refrain from willing them, and finally to turn away from them. This is meant by the Lord's words, "My yoke is easy, and my burden is light." But it ought to be known that the difficulty of so thinking and of resisting evils increases so far as man from his will does evils. For in the same measure he becomes accustomed to them, until he no longer sees them, and at length loves them, and from the delight of his love excuses them and confirms them by all kinds of fallacies, and declares them to be allowable and good. This is what happens when those who in early youth plunge into evils without restraint, and then at the same time reject divine things from the heart. The way that leads to heaven and the way that leads to hell were once represented to me. There was a broad way tending towards the left or the north, and many spirits were seen going in it. But at a distance, a quite large stone was seen, where the broad way came to an end. From that stone, two ways were branched off, one to the left and one in the opposite direction to the right. The way that went to the left was narrow and restricted, leading through the west to the south, and thus into the light of heaven. The way that went to the right was broad and spacious, leading obliquely downwards towards hell. All, at first, seemed to be going the same way, until they came to the large stone at the place where two ways met. When they reached that point, they were separated. The good turned to the left and entered the restricted way that led to heaven, while the evil, not seeing the stone at the fork of the ways, fell upon it and were hurt. And when they rose up, they ran on in the broad way to the right, which went towards hell. What all these things signified was afterwards explained to me, namely that by the first way, which was broad, wherein many, both good and evil, went together and talked with each other as friends, because there was no visible difference between them, were represented those who in externals live alike honestly and justly, and between whom seemingly there is no difference. By the stone where the two ways met, or at the corner, upon which the evil fell, and from which they then ran along the way leading to hell, was represented the divine truth, which is rejected by those who look towards hell. And in the highest sense by this stone was signified the Lord's divine human. But those who at the same time acknowledged the truth and the divine of the Lord were borne along the way that led to heaven. From these things again it was clear that in externals the evil lead the same kind of life as the good, or go the same way, that is, one as readily as the other. And yet that those who from the heart acknowledge the divine, especially those within the church who acknowledge the divine of the Lord, are led to heaven, while those who do not are born to hell. The thoughts of man that proceed from his intention or will are represented in the other life by ways, and ways are visibly presented there in exact accord with those thoughts of intention. And in accord with his thoughts that proceed from intention, everyone walks. For this reason, the character of spirits and their thoughts are known from their ways. From these things also it is clear what is meant by the Lord's words. Enter ye in through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many are those who walk along it. For straitened is the way, and narrow the gate that leadeth to life, and few be they who find it. The way that leads to life is straitened not because it is difficult, but because there are few who find it, as is said here. By the stone seen at the corner, where the broad and common way ended, and from which two ways were seen to lead in opposite directions, is illustrated what is signified by these words of the Lord. Have ye not read what is written? The stone which the builders rejected was made the head of the corner. Whosoever shall fall upon that stone shall be broken. Stone signifies divine truth, and the stone of Israel, the Lord in respect of his divine human. The builders are those who are of the church. The head of the corner is where the two ways are. To fall and to be broken is to deny and perish. I have been permitted to talk with some in the other life who had withdrawn from worldly affairs that they might live in a pious and holy manner. Also with some who had afflicted themselves in various ways, believing that they were thereby renouncing the world and subduing the lusts of the flesh. But as most of these have thus acquired a sorrowful life, and had withdrawn from the life of charity, which life can be lived only in the world, they are incapable of being associated with angels, because the life of angels is a life of joy, resulting from a state of blessedness, and consists in performing good deeds, which are works of charity. Moreover, those who have lived a life withdrawn from worldly employments are inflamed with the idea of their own merit, and are continually desiring heaven on that account, and thinking of heavenly joy as a reward, utterly ignorant of what heavenly joy is. When such are admitted into the company of angels and into their joy, which discards merit and consists in active labours and practical services, and in a blessedness resulting from the good thereby accomplished, they are astonished, like those who see something quite foreign to their belief. And since they are not receptive of that joy, they go away and ally themselves with spirits of their own kind, who have lived in the world a life like their own. But those who have lived a holy life in externals, constantly attending church and praying and afflicting their souls, and at the same time have thought constantly of themselves that they would be esteemed and honoured for all this above others, and finally after death would be accounted saints, such in the other life are not in heaven, because they have done all this for the sake of themselves. And as they have defiled divine truths by the self-love in which they have immersed them, some of them are so insane as to think themselves gods. Consequently, they are in hell among those like themselves. Some are cunning and deceitful, and are in the hells of the deceitful. These are such as by means of cunning arts and devices have maintained such pious conduct in external form as induced the common people to believe that they possessed a divine sanctity. Of this character are many of the saints of the pontifical religion. I have been permitted to talk with some of them, and their life was then plainly described, such as it had been in the world, and as it was afterwards. All these things have been said to make known that the life that leads to heaven is not a life withdrawn from the world, but a life in the world, and that a life of piety separated from a life of charity, which is possible only in the world, does not lead to heaven. But a life of charity does. And a life of charity consists in acting honestly and justly in every employment, in every business, and in every work, from an interior, that is, from a heavenly motive. And this motive is in that life whenever man acts honestly and justly, because doing so is in accord with the divine laws. Such a life is not difficult. But a life of piety separate from a life of charity is difficult. And to the extent that such a life is believed to lead towards heaven, so it leads away from heaven.